Apologies for that again. So good morning, everybody. As I was saying, I hope you have, well, I don't hope, I'm actually entirely sure that you have brilliant weather on that part of the world and that you are enjoying a beautiful morning there as we start these discussions about rules of origin. As Maria said, I think that the objective of our discussion today is for me really to give you a sense or an introduction to what rules of origin are, and I'll try to do my best to try to make sure to identify the reasons why rules of origin are important, particularly for private firms and for businesses. So what we'll do now over the next hour or so is to go through what rules of origin are, and I'll try to explain to you then also the different options that people usually use to design, to craft, or to negotiate rules of origin. We'll then see how rules of origin affect firms and businesses so that then your interest in this morning's presentation is clear. And finally, we will brainstorm a bit, hopefully together, about options to try to minimize the risks and the challenges that rules of origin may create for businesses, while at the same time benefiting fully from the opportunities that rules of origin may create. So I should also maybe, just before I go ahead, say a few words about myself. I am, as Maria said, a trade policy specialist in the market access division of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization is an intergovernmental organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, and our work is to develop rules that are agreed by all countries that are members to the WTO, and which will then regulate the way foreign trade is made among members of the WTO. So it's an organization, the business of which is to create these rules or help members create these rules and then administer these rules. So our work really is to work with the rules that guide and that regulate international trade. Rules of origin are also part of the web of agreements that we manage, and as such, we do work a little bit on rules of origin. But most of what I'll be discussing today are not the specific rules here at the WTO, but rather generally rules of origin as a concept, and then maybe also more in a preferential context, which, as we will see, is more likely to be relevant for firms in Trinidad and Tobago. Just a quick word about myself also. I'm a national from Brazil. I've been working at the WTO for the past 4 years, almost 5, and before that I worked also for the United Nations. I am a little bit cold. I got a cold, so if you hear me coughing and trying to deal here with a runny nose, apologies for that. The good news is that because you're so far away, it's not contagious at all. Now, having gone through that longer introduction, let me say a few words then about what rules of origin are. So, rules of origin. Before we talk about rules of origin, what is origin? What exactly is origin? If you look at the dictionary, you will see that origin is defined as the fact of being born from somewhere, the source, the ancestry, the beginning of something. And I would say that, it sounds quite logical, but, let's try to make a parallel between merchandise, between exports and people. I'm sure each of you in the room has a origin. Most likely you would answer that your origin is the place where you were born, or maybe where your parents were born, or maybe if you've resided a long time in a foreign country, maybe that foreign country, if you've lived there long enough. Well, think of precisely the way origin functions for people you have certain benefits which are associated with your nationality. If your origin is to be from Trinidad and Tobago, you can certainly vote in that country. You can have a work permit. You can look for a job in that country. You can buy property. If I travel there, because I don't have that nationality, most likely I will not have the same benefits, and there would be certain limitations to what I can do. So, for instance, I would certainly not be able to vote, or maybe to run for office there. Well, with goods, it's exactly the same thing. With merchandise and goods, it's exactly the same thing. Goods also have an origin. Of course, they are not born, but goods are manufactured, are processed, are harvested, are fished. So they'll have an origin, and that origin will give them certain benefits. So if a mango comes from Tobago, it will certainly have no issue being brought to Trinidad and consumed in Port of Spain. If that same mango came from Grenada or Jamaica, it will certainly also have facility or a possibility of being sold in Port of Spain by virtue of certain agreements that facilitate that trade. If the mango came from Brazil, on the other hand, there would certainly also be the possibility of selling that mango in the market there, but certain conditions would be attached. So the same way people have benefits and rights that derive from their origin, goods also have certain privileges if they have the right origin. Now, the same way people also can change origin, if you reside for a long time in a foreign country, or if you get married to the foreign of another country and you might acquire that nationality, similarly, goods can change their nationality. So, if the mango from Tobago eventually goes to Brazil and is transformed into jam, someone might argue that that's no longer jam from Trinidad and Tobago, but it's jam from Brazil. So at some point, goods, because of substantial transformation or transformation, may also change their origin. And that is the reason why you need rules. Goods are not all simple. They're not all manufactured in a single country. So most likely, there is a need for rules that say when a good stops being from one country and starts being from another country. That's what rules of origin are about. Now, you could argue, fair enough, but, why do they matter? At the end of the day, governments come with all sorts of weird rules and regulations. Why do rules of origin matter at all? Why are we having this webinar here? And why should firms be concerned about rules of origin? I will mention many reasons throughout the presentation, and hopefully by the end of this presentation you will get a better sense of why firms should have an interest in rules of origin. But let me maybe summarize with these 4 points that you see on screen here. The first thing is that rules of origin regulate the conditions of market access. They regulate the conditions under which goods can enter markets. And in that sense, rules of origin can simply affect your ability to tap into a new market or not. The second issue is rules of origin, because they deal with market access and because they affect the conditions of trade, can have a significant effect on product cost and therefore can influence the competitiveness of a producer, of an exporter in a foreign market. Third, rules of origin are a quite significant criterion in the cloud of criteria that lead to decisions, investment decisions, and decisions to bring capital to a foreign market. So we will also develop this further during the presentation, but it's quite clear that rules of origin affect also investment decisions and foreign investment. Finally, and this is related to the last point, rules of origin may also influence firms' decision when it comes to the choice of suppliers. So in order to maybe comply with the rule, you might need to consider changing your suppliers. Or in order to benefit from market access that is made available through rules of origin, you might need or you might consider changing your suppliers to do so. So because of these, and we will develop these ideas throughout the presentation, but because of these, I would say rules of origin create challenges for businesses. They may enhance business risks and the risks inherent to foreign trade. They might be one of the items that create these risks. But at the same time, they also open opportunities. So firms that have knowledge about rules of origin and firms that invest in enhancing their understanding of these rules can certainly minimize risks, minimize the challenges, and enhance the opportunities from rules of origin. So there you go. I hope you are convinced that this will be an interesting presentation for you, especially if your firm is engaged in export-import operations. Now, if we say, okay, fair enough, let's take a look at rules of origin and see, what exactly the risks are that they create and how to benefit from them. The question then becomes, when do firms come across rules of origin? What are the different utilizations that government makes of rules of origin? I'll propose a few examples to you and then we'll summarize after a few slides. First example is this one. Trinidad and Tobago might not implement import quotas, but you have several governments in the world that import goods subject to certain quotas. An example here on screen is imports of high-quality beef into the European Union market. The European Union has a regulated system to import beef, and that system is based on quotas. Each country that trades with the EU has a quota for beef. So what you see here, for instance, is that for 2012-13, Argentina was allowed to export 30,000 tons of beef into the EU. Australia a little bit more than 7,000. Uruguay, sorry, I had a message here. And as you can see here, Uruguay has 6,000 tons, and so on and so forth. So see the way the different countries here can export beef to the EU. What you see in the third column is what they are actually utilizing of their quotas. You see that Argentina there, for instance, utilized a little bit more than 81% of the quota that it had, whereas Uruguay almost filled in entirely its quota. Now, the only way a government may implement this system and manage this system is using rules of origin, because when beef reaches customs, customs would need to say who this beef should be allocated to. And if you take the case of Uruguay, when they fill in entirely their quota, exporters there could be tempted to send their beef to Brazil or to Argentina and to have it re-exported to the EU. Because there, once they filled in their quota, they can't export anymore, but these other countries might. So they may want to transship their beef there and have it sent. The only way the European Union would be able to manage correctly the quotas is to apply rules of origin and say, this comes from Uruguay, not from Brazil or Argentina, and therefore it can or cannot be allowed in depending on what the quota situation is. So this is one example. Import quotas is one area where rules of origin will be important. And of course, you can imagine that having the right origin here, having an origin of a country that is allowed quotas, might be a strategic decision, whereas having an origin from a country that has exhausted its quotas or that doesn't have any quotas would be a business mistake, of course. Now, let's see another example here. When I was preparing this presentation, I thought, let's go and check in the Ministry of Planning of Trinidad and Tobago what the trade partners of Trinidad and Tobago are. And I came across that table that you see on screen, where you see the main sources of imports for Trinidad and Tobago. So where goods were coming from in January to March 2011, and you see there, for instance, that Trinidad and Tobago imported mainly from Colombia, the United States, Gabon, Brazil, China, so on and so forth. Now, the only reason we are able to compile numbers like this, statistics like this, is because customs of Trinidad and Tobago make annotations of the goods when they come into the country, and that then is compiled, is processed by the Central Statistical Office. So on the basis of origin and value and product description, we can then aggregate the data and have a vision about, what the trade profile of Trinidad and Tobago is. So trade statistics will also necessitate the utilization of rules of origin. Now, another example, and this is from the Economic Times of India, a newspaper from India. This is a report that the government of New Delhi is likely to impose anti-dumping duties on aluminum wheels for vehicles imported from China, Thailand, and Korea. The government did an investigation and, might conclude that wheels from these three countries are being sold in India below their production cost. Now, if that is so, this would also necessitate rules of origin, because when aluminum wheels reach customs in India, they will be charged import duties only if they come from China, Thailand, and Korea, but all other wheels coming from any other exporter should not be subject to that duty, to that anti-dumping duty, simply because they have not found that other countries also engage in dumping. So the implementation, the application of anti-dumping will also necessitate rules of origin and a differentiation of the duty in function of the country of origin. Let's take another example now. These are related to sanitary inspections, embargoes, and generally sanitary legislation. A couple of years ago, this was in 2010, there were a couple of cases of mad cow disease found in certain states of Brazil. So some governments, including Russia here, forbade completely imports of beef from Brazil. Now, fair enough, they had scientific evidence, they had reasons to be to exert caution and maybe not import beef from Brazil. The question here is, beef from other parts of Latin America, and the examples I'm giving here are Argentina and Uruguay, were perfectly fine. There was no scientific evidence that beef from these countries could be harmful in any manner. Therefore, you also need rules of origin and a distinction, an identification of country of origin in order to apply, to implement sanitary measures. And in this case, the embargo. It would have been unfair to subject beef from Argentina, Uruguay, or any other country to sanitary embargoes when they were not affected by disease. So here you have another example of a case where having the right origin can make a lot of business sense. Now, sticking to this example, maybe something that I can also comment on is it could be clever for a Brazilian exporter to send his beef to Uruguay or Argentina and have it then shipped to Russia to avoid the embargo. Now, the only problem is that, of course, this would be circumventing or bypassing legislation, sanitary legislation taken in this case in Russia. So you need their rules of origin in order to be able to identify what exactly is beef from Argentina and what is not, so that customs officers can make a decision about whether or not the beef can be allowed in and or whether it has to be subject to an embargo. So there you go, another quite interesting example. Now, the examples I've mentioned so far all relate to foreign trade. But there's also something which relates more to domestic policies and that affects foreign trade, and this is labeling. I'm sure all of you are accustomed, used to the fact that when you take a good, you can see the label and see the country of origin of that good. The example I've put here on screen is meat, because currently in the United States you have a revision of the legislation concerning the marking of country of origin in meat, pork, and poultry. And what is now required under their legislation, and which should come into effect very soon, is that meat should have an indication of where the animal was born, where it was slaughtered, and where it was raised. So what you see there in the case of this beef, for instance, is beef cattle from Mexico, born in Mexico, raised and slaughtered in the United States. Well, there too, in addition to the obligation of marking, in addition to the labeling obligation, the legislation will have to come with rules that tell you, that define what slaughtering is, what raising is, and which give rules to the different scenarios that could come up. So there you go. Labeling, although it's a domestic policy, consumer safety and so on, affects foreign trade, because if you're exporting meat into the United States, you must comply with those obligations. You must check what the rules of origin regarding that marking are, and you must make sure to have the right origin indicated, of course, unless you may risk being accused of misleading labeling or, false indication of origin and that type of thing. Now, a last example of where rules of origin are applied, and this is the more common, this is certainly what comes to mind when to most people when we talk about rules of origin, this relates to the utilization of trade preferences. So the example I'm giving here is the example of an export of a pyjama into the United States. Now, if that pyjama came from Mexico, which you see there on top, you will see that you will pay 0 duties when it goes into the United States, because it has preferential access into that market by virtue of the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Area. If that pyjama came from Jordan, the origin of the pyjama was Jordan, then it could also actually come duty-free into the United States by virtue of a bilateral agreement between the United States and Jordan. If it came from Pakistan, it would need to pay full import duties, because these two countries don't have an agreement between themselves, and the duties amount to 16%. Now, if it came from Australia, you would pay about 8% of customs duties, import duties, and this is despite a free trade agreement that exists between the two countries, but the agreement is being still put into effect. So the duty is still not 0. It's coming down, but it's still not 0. And finally, the example you see there is a country from sub-Saharan Africa, which has preferences into the United States by virtue of AGOA. Now, the last line there is an interesting one, and maybe I should comment on it, is what the United States calls the general duty. general duty basically means that whenever the origin of a good cannot be assessed, or when there's fraud, or when documentation is not correct, the general duty will apply. And as you can see there, it's very high. It's 76%. So there again, as businesses, if you are making an investment decision, if you are an investor, a foreign investor, and you want to know where to locate your mills in order to produce pyjamas, you might choose a country that has preferential access to the United States. That, of course, with all other things being equal, because this will certainly not be the only criterion that you would take into consideration, but all the things being equal, origin and preferential access could be an argument. And this is, in fact, the main argument behind the negotiation of this agreement. Now, a last point before I move on is that the only way customs can get through that maze of possibilities and origin is by relying on a proof of origin, on documentary evidence. What is usually given to prove origin is something I'm sure you know, which is called the certificate of origin. So firms need to obtain a certificate of origin simply to prove that they comply with the rules under a specific agreement, the benefits of which they are claiming. Now, this is just a summary. When it comes to preferential treatment, you have, as I said, a maze of possibilities. There are many types of different agreements that could come across. There are bilateral agreements. This is the case of, say, EU-Chile, US-Korea. The case of, for instance, the agreement that one specific country can negotiate with another one. You have regional free trade agreements, like the EU, like NAFTA, like CARICOM as well. And then you have region-to-region agreements also, and this would be the case, for instance, of the European Union CARIFORUM Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA. Then you also have non-reciprocal agreements, and these are agreements in which countries simply grant preferences to less developed countries to help trade from these countries. And you have a number of the Caribbean Basin Initiative that the United States has put in place for Caribbean countries. You also have Canada's general preferential tariff, and you have other examples as well. Many countries are extending this type of regime now, so new opportunities could also be coming up there. Now, anytime there's a preferential agreement of whichever type they may be, there will be rules of origin associated with them. And this for the simple reason that you will need rules of origin in order to prove, in order to regulate which goods are allowed in under that agreement and which goods are not. So if we summarize, rules of origin will be utilized by governments for a variety of reasons. We talked about quotas, we talked about the identification of import duties, we talked about anti-dumping, sanitary measures, trade statistics, and labeling as well. So as you see already from this panorama, there could be many interfaces, many circumstances in which firms would come across rules of origin in different contexts, and if you master these rules, you may not be affected by some of these trade restrictive measures, and if you don't master the rules, you may actually be surprised by some of these measures, in which case then the rules of origin would be creating business risks and enhancing uncertainty related to trade for your firm. If there are any questions, or if you want to comment on any of the slides or any of the points, please just send me a message and I'm happy to pause and comment further, elaborate further on any of these points if you have an interest, okay? If there are no comments or if I'm not seeing any message, then I'll just continue on with the presentation and we can also discuss any other points at the end of the presentation. So now that you know what rules of origin are, now that you know more or less where they're implemented, why they're implemented, and now that hopefully you also have a sense of how these rules affect businesses, let's see now how the rules of origin are crafted. How can they be designed? If you're seeking to understand and master rules of origin, you have to be able to read and understand them. Now, this is just to give you a sense, an introduction, of course, to rules of origin, because it could be quite complex, it could be quite technical. So here I'm really just offering some notions so that we can have a common understanding of the basic jargon related to rules of origin. Now, rules of origin can be national. So, as you saw, for instance, in the case of the meat labeling in the United States, there is an American legislation in that area, and that is entirely national. That is entirely decided upon by the country itself. United States has certain type of these rules. European Union, Japan, Brazil, Peru. They have a variety of countries that have legislation regarding origin, either with relation to labeling or with relation to other topics. These rules can also be bilateral, so they'll be negotiated between two governments. And here you also have a variety of examples that we could find. All of those free trade agreements we discussed previously would be illustrations of this type of rules of origin. One example which I'm citing here, and you can see on your screen, is the European Union CARIFORUM Economic Partnership Agreement. The rules in that agreement have been negotiated between CARIFORUM nations, CARICOM and Dominican Republic nations, and European Union negotiators. And the result should be a negotiated set of rules among the two countries. Then you also have rules which are decided plurilaterally or say regionally, and this is the example of the CARICOM. The community also has the rules of origin that define what community products are, and that was negotiated among countries of the region. And then you also have rules which are multilateral. So you have some guidelines which come from Switzerland, from the World Trade Organization, and which all countries should implement. So as you can see, there could be quite a complex web of different rules which apply either simultaneously or one supplementing or complementing the other. So you have to first thing identify the product at stake, and here all rules usually use the harmonized system of nomenclature to identify goods. Then you identify the actual rule. Once you know the product at stake, you identify the rule and the agreement that applies to it, and then you apply the rule. Noting, of course, that the rule could have exceptions or certain flexibilities that firms could also seek to benefit from. Once that has been done, you will need to demonstrate that you comply with the rule. And the way this is done is through the certificate of origin, which we discussed previously. So let me try to leave you for a minute to think about this. How could we come up with a rule of origin for a fairly simple good? These are cotton pyjamas, but you have the case in which the cotton comes from Malawi, the yarn comes from Pakistan, the fabric comes from South Africa, and it was also dyed in South Africa. You have buttons coming from India. South African manufacturer cuts it into parts, prints the motifs that you see, and then all these different parts are assembled in Malawi before being exported, and they also pay copyright licenses to the United States because they're utilizing, as you see there, material from the Disney company. how could we then determine what the origin of this good would be? Think a little bit about that. Well, there are several possibilities, many different possibilities. We could be looking at, I don't know, who sewed all the different parts together. We could be looking into value, who has the greatest value. We could see who has the largest number of processes here. You see that South Africa comes up quite often. I mean, there could be a huge variety of possibilities. The point here is you need a rule to come and give certainty to what this is. Because if you are the producer of this pajama, what you need to know is what the rule is so that you can adapt your production and know what you should write on the label in terms of country of origin, made in. Also, if you are an exporter, you want to know what the rule is so that you know whether you can claim preferential origin or not, and therefore save money on import duties. So a rule has to be either negotiated or adopted unilaterally, but it has to be made known and it has to be clear and predictable for businesses to then adopt. Now, what are some of these possibilities that would come up? And here we go already into the jargon of rules of origin. The first possibility would be to speak about wholly obtained goods. Wholly obtained goods are the goods that are obtained in a single country. And I'll give you examples of that in just a second. Another possibility is, and this is the case where several countries collaborated to produce a single good, is to look at the country that has substantially transformed the product. So the rules will need to define what substantial transformation is, and here they could use either value, content, value consideration, they could use tariff classification, or they could identify a specific manufacturing process. And I'll comment on each of them now. Wholly obtained goods. Now, these are the easiest cases because these are goods that are produced in a single country. So it can be animals born and raised in a country. It can be animals obtained by hunting, fishing, plants that were harvested, minerals extracted from the earth of that country, scrap which was obtained also in that country, irrespective of where the original goods came from. Now, these goods are simple because they don't have many countries intervening in their production, and usually they'll be identified, named, enumerated in an agreement as such. So this is the easiest type of product for companies and for customs verifying the origin. A little bit more complicated is the case of products where several countries cooperated or collaborated in the production process. Here, as with our pajama before, you have several possibilities to craft a rule. And the choice for one or another possibility depends on the negotiators to an agreement and their preference. There are no rules as to one or another type of family. What are these three types of families? You have value addition, and here the only things that matter are value additional number of actors have added into a product. The second possibility is changing tariff classification. You might have heard about the CTH or tariff shift, and this is where we compare the final good with the inputs that were used in its production. If the two are different, if the tariff classification of the materials are different from the tariff classification of the final good, there could be substantial transformation, and therefore a new origin would be acquired by the goods. And the final family regards specific processes. This is the case in which the rule identifies a specific manufacturing process that grants origin to the entire good. Now, I know this is abstract, so let us look into specific examples now. Take fertilizers. Fertilizers are mainly made of chemical components, of which I decided to concentrate here on nitrate, potassium, and phosphate. The different elements are blended together, and they are granulated if they want to be sold in a solid form, or they could be diluted in water if they're going to be sold in a liquid form. Now, let's think about rules of origin for fertilizers under these three same families of origin. One possibility, and this is perhaps the most common, and certainly the family that was used in the CARICOM, is that 30% of value of that fertilizer must be added within the region for it to acquire preferential origin. So a producer in Trinidad and Tobago could be bringing the chemical components from anywhere in the world, but as long as he's able to demonstrate that he's adding 30% of the total value of that good within Trinidad and Tobago, he would be then allowed to export that fertilizer under preferences within all CARICOM. A variation of that rule, which you sometimes find, is that not more than X%, 70% in this case, of the value of the good must not come from non-preferential origin, from another country. So here, instead of focusing on the value that was added locally, the rule is focusing on the value that was brought from abroad. But it adds up to the same concept. Another possibility is now moving to the second family, change of tariff heading. This is where you compare the tariff classification of the chemicals and the tariff classification of the fertilizer. If the two are different, or sufficiently different depending on what the rule is, then you will find that there was substantial transformation and the product complies with the rules and therefore has preferential status. And finally, the final example is one in which we do not look into value, we do not look into classification and tariff classification. We simply look at the way the product is manufactured and identify processes that are deemed to transform it substantially. And an example here is the origin of the fertilizer is the place where the ammonium was obtained, or the place where the chemical products were blended together. So there you go, a single product, fertilizer, but three very different possibilities of crafting rules of origin. And as I said, understanding the way these rules are crafted and the implications that it will have are important, because under one situation, under one rule, a fertilizer can have preferential origin, but it might not comply with the rule in another case and therefore not have preferential origin. Let's work out now two exercises just to illustrate the 2 points. This is an example using value added. Think of a rule in NAFTA that says that for a drill, the origin of the drill will be preferential if the country exporting it has added 40% of X works price. X works price means the price immediately after production, so not taking into account any export prices. Now, in this case, what you need here is to know the final value of the good as well as the value of the inputs that were used. So what I've listed there is the value of the case, the electric command, the engine, other parts, and then labor and profit. In this case, Mexico, where the drill is being manufactured, is responsible for 60% of the value of the good. That is the case plus labor plus profit. In that case, the rule requires Mexico to add at least 40% of value. Because it is adding in this case 60%, it complies with the rule and can therefore export the goods to the United States, claiming preferences under NAFTA. Now, what is important to note here is that it would still be able to export even if it was not complying with the rule. However, it would not be able, the producer would not be able to claim preferences and avoid import duties. So it would still be allowed to export, of course. So you see here that value-added considerations are quite complex because they require a complete bill of material for the good. It requires knowledge about the final value of the good, and it also requires to understand what can be factored in and what may not be factored in computing value. So in this case, for instance, we see that labor and profit can be taken into consideration, but this might not be the case under all agreements and in all circumstances. So a knowledge of the rule itself, but also of the procedurals of the rule are important in this case. Let's now see a second example, and this is not on value. This is working with tariff shift or changing tariff classification. You have the case of cars that are assembled in South Africa, and this manufacturer brings the chassis with the engine from the United States, all other parts from China, and then a complex airbag and braking system from Sweden. He puts all of that together in South Africa, and the question is, where is that car from? Well, if the rule is, as you see there in the bottom of the slide, if the rule is change of tariff heading, what you need to know is what the heading of the parts are and what the heading of the final good is. If these two are different, there was a substantial transformation. So in this case, you see here that the engine was in 8706, the parts in 8708, as well as the airbag, and the final car is in heading 8703. Therefore, as you can see, 8703 is different from the other headings. So the origin of the car is South Africa, because South Africa changed the tariff heading of the materials, of the pieces, of the components that he was using, and manufactured a good that is completely different, that made a good that is classified in a completely different manner. You see that in this case, you don't need to know value, you don't need a complete bill of lading, of materials, but you do require good knowledge of tariff classification and the nomenclature, the HS nomenclature, in order to be able to assess the manufacturing process. Now, there are a few other concepts related to rules of origin which you would need to understand or to know before we can have a discussion about the effect of rules of origin. First one is direct consignment. This is something that is found in all preferential agreements, and basically the underlying assumption is that the good must be exported directly from the producing country to the consuming country. However, that sometimes is not possible. You don't have shipping lines, or you have logistical reasons why you need transshipment. In that case, what this notion would require is that there is some proof that the goods are not tampered with or that they do not undergo further processing during the transshipment. This is quite important, and it can affect directly products, particularly from your region of the world, simply because you might have shipping lines which require transshipment before the good then reaches its final destination. Another concept related to rules of origin, which is quite important, is that of minimal operation. Here the idea is that agreements will list certain processes which in any case will never change the origin of goods. So these are things like affixing labels, simple mixing, simply assembling parts, slaughtering of animals, packaging or presenting goods for sales, preserving the goods for their transportation, and so on and so forth. You really have to check each of the agreements to see what these processes are, but they could have an impact depending on what activities your firm concentrate on. They could have an impact on the origin of your goods. You will also have rules related to packaging, spare parts, tools, something related to what we call de minimis. I will not comment on them. I simply have put them on screen so that you have the reference to these rules on your own time. You will have access to this presentation after this morning's webinar, so you can check this. But these are some other important concepts, and I will spend some time explaining cumulation or accumulation. Cumulation is simply a flexibility that is built into preferential agreements whereby a producer may utilize components and parts from selected other countries without any consequence for the origin. So, for instance, in CARICOM, you may utilize any input from any other CARICOM country, even if the good is produced in Trinidad, for instance, but then that will not affect the fact that the good has community status, has community origin, and can circulate freely in the region. So, if you're producing sausages, you could very easily imagine the case of a producer of sausages in Trinidad and Tobago that brings meat from Trinidad and Tobago, from Jamaica, then spices from Grenada, blends it together, produces the sausages, and as you can see, although you have inputs, you have parts, you have materials here from 3 different CARICOM countries, because you were able to accumulate in your production process with this country, your origin is not affected. Now, this is important for Caribbean countries because you typically do not have the capacity to produce all inputs that you need yourself, and you may not be able to supply yourself in the region or in your country. So it's important to have the ability to bring these inputs from other countries and yet maintain your origin. So an example here I've drawn from the Economic Partnership Agreement with the European Union. It is one in which the rule of origin is 40%. So in order to export under preferences to the European Union, you have to demonstrate that 40% of the good was added in Trinidad and Tobago. So in my example here, you are bringing meat from Brazil, you are bringing spices from Barbados, you are bringing packaging from Mexico, and you are bringing preservatives from the European Union. And what you see in the chart there is the distribution of value there. You see here that Trinidad and Tobago, where the labor is done for this meat preparation, is only responsible for 20% of the final value of the good. So, if you are considering Trinidad and Tobago alone, you would not have preferential access to the European Union under the EPA because the rule requires 40% and you only have 20%. That could be labor costs and profit and so on. But if Trinidad and Tobago is able to accumulate with Barbados, for instance, your value already reaches 30%. And because you're exporting to the EU and you have cumulation with EU countries, you can also add the 10%, and there you are already at 40%. So now you have acquired preferential rules of origin. And in the case of the EPA, the agreement also identifies Mexico as one of the countries you can cumulate with. So in fact, all the value from the EU, Mexico, Barbados, and Trinidad and Tobago can be computed as being one, as being cumulative. So the total value added by the producer in Trinidad and Tobago to produce this meat, processed meat preparation, was actually 10 plus 20 plus 10 plus 15. Right? So 55% of value of the good comes from the region. Therefore, it complies with the rule. But you see, as an exporter, unless you are aware that you can cumulate, you will not be claiming the preference because you believe that you simply do not reach the rule. Now, we have discussed what rules of origin are, how they can be crafted. Let's see now how they affect trade and firms. And this will be the last part of our discussion this morning. The most common circumstances in which firms come across rules of origin is either when they seek to obtain a certificate of origin, they go to their Chamber of Commerce or Customs or Ministry of Trade, depending on who issues the certificate, and they find out that they need to provide certain information to obtain that certificate. Sometimes the information you need to provide is complex, it's burdensome, and here you might already have some procedural challenges in order to obtain the certificate, and that in itself can be already quite challenging. There's another circumstance in which firms come across rules of origin, and this is where the certificate can be obtained, but we don't know which rule to apply, or we don't know what rule applies, or we do know what the rule is, and the rule might be too cumbersome or too complex or too complicated. Here, it's not the procedure itself that is a problem, but rather the rule. Now, these two challenges are quite common, and there's no surprise that in businesses surveys, rules of origin and certificates always come as the number one or number two most common barrier that firms face when they try to export. And that is also true in the Caribbean region where this surveys have been conducted. Now, this is particularly acute if we know that virtually all countries of the world today require certificates of origin, have a large web of free trade agreements, sometimes overlapping, and also countries might have both free trade agreements with preferential rules, but also a set of rules which apply for all goods irrespective of preferential origin. So what we call non-preferential origin. And you have you have at least 40 WTO member states that have this type of requirements. So at the end of the day, firms will see their interest affected by rules of origin, whether it is that they are making investment decisions, whether it is that they're trying to identify market access opportunities, whether it is that they are trying to choose their suppliers, or whether it is a case where they're simply trying to structure their production in order to benefit from certain agreements. Now, take this example, and this is an example where a country was able to benefit from the rule in a quite clever manner. Investors from Chinese Taipei tried to export garments into the United States and Europe in the 90s, and noticed that they had to face very high tariffs. They also noted that Madagascar, by virtue of preferences that it received, did not have to face such high tariffs. So of course, what did they do? They decided to locate part of their production in Madagascar and there to export to the European Union and the United States. Now, the only reason that setup was possible was because the rules of origin allowed the producer to bring inputs from Taiwan or from elsewhere, manufacture them, process them, substantially transform them in Madagascar, and then get them sent to other markets. So you needed, well, of course you needed an investment climate, political climate there that was conducive to investment, but you also needed flexible rules of origin to allow for this setup. Now, let me just show you what the rules of origin were. In the preferences to the European Union, they could produce garments in Madagascar, but the agreement said they needed to bring the fabrics from an Africa, Caribbean, or Pacific country, so Mauritius, for instance. They could bring it from the European Union, or they could bring it from South Africa. When exporting to the United States, on the other hand, the agreement, the preferences of the United States, allowed them to bring the fabric from anywhere in the world. It didn't matter where they wanted to bring it from. The only thing that mattered was that they substantially transformed the goods in Madagascar. So the producer in this case brought goods from China, India, and Singapore. The only consideration in the second case was quality and price. The consideration in the first case was quality and price and rules of origin and cumulation obligation. Second case, no cumulation obligation. Now, by virtue of this setup, Madagascar was able to receive a lot of foreign investment to produce garments for the European Union and the United States. Garments actually made up to 50% of exports of that country in 2006, and most of the goods that were exported to the United States and to Europe could utilize these preferences. So you see there 88% of preference utilization for the European Union under the Cotonou Agreement, and 97% of preferences to the United States. Now, where did the fabrics come from? In the case of the EU, 95% of the fabrics came from Mauritius. And when it was exported to China, 90% of the fabrics came from China when it was exported to the United States. So you see here that the only reason why Mauritius and China came into the picture was because of rules of origin, was because the producer from Taiwan, the investor from Taiwan, was seeking inputs or seeking material in order to benefit from the preferences and comply with the rules of origin under these preferences. So here you see how the choice of supplier and how investment decisions, location decisions, and trading opportunities could be shaped up by rules of origin under these agreements. Of course, you could argue this is not the only thing. Things like, infrastructure, political climate, credit availability, know-how of the workforce, capacity to repatriate capital, things like this, of course, come into play as well. But as I said, all other things being equal, rules of origin played a huge factor, a huge role here in this decision. Now, just another word about choice of suppliers as well, and this is something that I think affects quite heavily small countries. Take the case of a producer located in Jamaica who wants to produce cosmetic sets, vanity sets, in Jamaica to export to several countries. So he brings the case, he's able to produce the case himself, a textile case in Jamaica. He brings a comb from China. He brings makeup from France, so the European Union, and brings a mirror from China. The question is, those processes, as you see here, expose himself quite heavily to rules of origin because he has many suppliers and because he's exporting to several countries. So if he tries to export to Trinidad and Tobago, the first thing will be to identify the relevant rule. And here we'll be talking about CARICOM rules. If the rules in CARICOM is, let's say, 40% of value for that set, he will have to see whether or not he's able, with his case, plus putting everything together, process and labor, to reach the 40%. If he's willing to export to the European Union, he might have to comply with a different rule, say 30% under the EPA. And if he's willing to export to Canada, he might have another rule, and this is just a fictitious rule because we don't yet have a free trade agreement with Canada, but just for the sake of the example, what I said here was, what is the rule is the country where the largest number of items were produced. So here you see that China actually has the largest number. So the origin of the good might be affected by the choice of suppliers, and he might need to change or adjust his suppliers in order to benefit from the two agreements simultaneously. Now, that of course will imply choices from the part of that producer to see whether they make business sense for him or not. Now, to conclude, how can businesses benefit from rules of origin and minimize the risk that they create? Several surveys, as I said, commented that rules of origin actually constituted hurdles, and there are studies that show that sometimes the cost of complying with rules of origin can be as high as 15% for a good, depending on how the production must be adjusted. Studies have also shown that larger firms find it easier to comply with different rules of origin than small firms. And the main reason for this, of course, is that large firms will have personnel dedicated to it, but they'll also have a better capacity to shift their suppliers or to shift their operations depending on the preferences they want to benefit from. So you see here, for instance, the size at the bottom of the slide, the size of the firms that are able to use preferential trade agreements vis-a-vis those that are not able to, and you see that it's much larger firms that use these agreements. Now, another important challenge as well is that the rules of origin can be sometimes conflicting. So if you take that example of the vanity set, you could have origin under one case, but you could be denied preferential origin under another case. So what this requires is either a choice from the part of the producer that, okay, exporting and paying duties is also an option that I'm going to choose, or adjusting the whole production in order to benefit from preferences. Sorry. Now, some thoughts of what I've seen in firms that are able to benefit from rules of origin and minimize the risks associated with origin. First, they try to incorporate what they call regulatory compliance into their business planning. So when you're thinking of a product, when you're assessing a new market access opportunity, rules of origin, preferential trade agreements, Paris classification will come up front in the planning. And I would say having that incorporated into the business plan as early as possible is something that minimizes risks of then finding as a surprise that the setup is not possible, or that the origin is denied, or that the origin you thought you had is deemed to be misleading, things like this. If possible, and this depends on the firm size, of course, it's useful to have a person specializing in the area of regulatory compliance as possible. That is the best case scenario in order to identify opportunities. A person who understands this issue and has capacity to read the rules, to seek for flexibilities in the rules, is a person who will be able to identify tariff-saving opportunities for the company. Third possibility is examining all of this regulatory aspects, including the rules of origin, can minimize risk. And here's a case where, for instance, if your made-in marking is something important to you, let's say that, a French company exporting cosmetics is very keen to keep made in France on its label because it considers that to be part of its business plan, business strategy, and a main marketing argument. In that case, you need to factor in and to have an examination of the regulation early when you're choosing suppliers and when you're choosing markets in order to avoid them losing that label, losing that marketing argument because your origin is not accepted. Finally, one possibility to reduce risks related to origin is to seek what we call binding rulings on origin. All governments of the world should provide, at the request of an exporter or importer, a binding ruling or an information that is binding on them regarding the origin assessment. So if you're planning to export or planning to invest and you want to have certainty about how your good will be treated, you can ask customs to look at your production pattern. You describe the good and you ask then customs of your export market to say how would this good be assessed if you were to be imported. And customs will issue an information which is binding on them for 2, 3, 4, 5 years depending on the government, and they'll respect that. So this is something that can greatly minimize the risk and enhance your security if you have a doubt related to origin. And it's something that I would really encourage all companies to utilize when they're making business plans. There you go. These were some thoughts. I have come to the end of my slides, but I am more than happy now to take in a few questions or comments if you have any, and elaborate further on any topics if I wasn't sufficiently clear. You also have my email address on screen, so feel free to write to me if you have questions or if you want to engage in a more specific discussion. And in any case, I have also promised exporTT that you can have this presentation as soon as we have finished, so you will also have reference to all the material I've presented. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Darlan. Does anyone have any questions that they would like to ask him at this time? Feel free to do so.
I have one question. Hello? You can... Oh, yes. I wanted to find out, is there any website, either by exporTT or the World Trade Organization, that we as businesses can access these list of agreements between countries or regions?
Hi, sorry, Maria, can you just repeat that for me? Because I heard you on the background and couldn't really understand it, please.
Okay. I was asking you, is there a list of the partnership agreements or trade agreements that businesses like ourselves can access either from exporTT or from the World Trade Organization?
Yes, we have a list of agreements here that you can have access to. So we can send that to you after.
Okay, thank you.
That's good.
Any other questions? Oh, if this is not the case, I hope I was. Oh no, I have a comment here. Can I go briefly over cumulation again? Is that correct?
I'm not seeing it, so maybe it came to you privately.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I did receive it privately. So let me go quickly back to Cumulation and just explain that again. Cumulation is basically flexibility that is built in the agreement and which allow a producer to source its imports from any country that is listed in the agreement, and those goods will then be considered originating in the same country. So as you see here, in my example, the agreement of the Economic Partnership Agreement listed European Union, CARICOM countries as countries that could cumulate with each other. So all products from one or the other were considered to come from a single region. And then it also added that the EU and Mexico should also be considered in cumulation. So what this means is that as a producer from Trinidad and Tobago, I need not be constrained by suppliers from Trinidad and Tobago only. I can go source myself in all of these countries that are enumerated without any fear of losing preferential status, because all of the enumerated countries will count as a single customs territory, as a single origin. So, as you see there in that example, although Trinidad and Tobago only has 20% of the value of that good, it will still be considered to be the origin of the good because it's cumulating with the other countries and meeting the 40% local content requirement. I hope this is now clearer and yeah.
Thanks a lot, Darlan. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, go ahead because we could talk now.
Hello?
Yes, hello, we're hearing you.
Yes, I'd like to know the intersection between the WTO TBT agreement and rules of origin.
I'm sorry again. I'm not sure I have understood. Maria, can you just repeat that for me, please?
How does the WTO TBT agreement relate to or intersect with the rules of origin?
Are you asking how does it relate to us? That's what you said. We're not hearing you clearly.
Yes.
What you're asking how the rules of origin, what? And what?
Yes. How do they differ?
Okay, I'm very sorry, but I can't hear sufficiently distinctly to answer. I can't understand the
He heard the question, Darlan.
He sent the question.
Yes, he did.
Okay, well, I have a question here from Leanne Romani, which I'm not sure is the same one we just heard. But okay, now Stacy sent a question as well. How does the WTO TBT agreement related to rules of origin? Well, that was the question, or was this maybe from Mukechi? Well, anyway, I have three questions here. Let me go one by one. First question is from Leanne Romani, and what she's asking is whether an exporter can benefit from several preferential rules of origin at the same time at any point in time. Well, you can shop for the best rule that suits your needs, but no, you cannot claim origin under several agreements because each agreement will have its own certificate of origin, its own rule, and once you choose which avenue to go, you'll have to go to that avenue. Doesn't mean that you have to do that at every export. You can change, but in any one single export operation, only one rule can be claimed, one agreement can be claimed. That's a general rule. Now, Stacy then asked about the TBT agreement and how it relates to rules of origin. The TBT agreement of the WTO relates to rules of origin because it contains obligations regarding labeling. And one of the items that we saw regarding labeling is country of origin, marking of origin, made in obligations. Now, that agreement only requires the country to have, requirements that are not discriminatory and that type of thing. So I would say there is a linkage, but it does not constrain whether or not countries can require mandatory origin labeling in their products. Actually, it would probably allow countries to have that requirement. Then Mchechi had a question: how does the rules of origin and the TBT agreement relate to each other? Well, I think I've just covered that. There is overlap to the extent that marking of origin, country labeling is concerned, but that's as far as it goes, not more than that. Okay, well, I think I have answered the questions I got here to the chat. Let me just ask you if you have any other questions, because if it's not the case, then I may need to run to another meeting.
Okay, well, it doesn't seem so. So I want to say thank you very much, Darlan, for agreeing to do this webinar for us, and we look forward to other similar webinars coming up. I also want to thank the ICD department who would have assisted us with testing the system, and also any other next week we had throughout the session. And I also want to say thank you to the participants as well who would have registered. We were scheduled to have 74 persons online this morning, and I'm hoping that we all did sign in and participate. I'm seeing one last question in the chat. I don't know if you can answer this before we leave.
Yeah, sure. I got a question just while you started to speak from Candice, asking whether rules of origin have precedence one over the other. And the example she's giving here is, CARICOM agreement and CARICOM bilateral agreement with the Dominican Republic or with Costa Rica. Well, here it's not a matter of precedence. It's really a matter of where you are exporting to and the choice that you are making. If you are exporting to Costa Rica, the only rules of origin that you will be able to claim are those in the CARICOM Costa Rica agreement. If you're exporting within the region, you will be able to claim CARICOM preferences using the Chagrama rules. So here, there's no hierarchy. However, I would say that there could be a case, let's just assume the case in which, let's assume Trinidad and Tobago with CARICOM signs a free trade agreement with Canada. So you have the rules of origin under that FTA, under that agreement, but then you also have preferences under, some Caribbean preferences that Canada gives. So then it does to be important to look at both agreements, to look at both rules of origin, and decide whichever you want to go with. But as I said, once you choose, you will have to go with one rule only. That's it for me then, Maria. Thank you.
Okay, great. So, as Darlan said, he will send the presentation to exporTT, and he will forward it to you, as well as we will include in that email to you an online evaluation, which we would really appreciate if you can complete for us, because we would like to improve our service to you, and as well as offer other similar webinars to support the exporters. So thank you once again, everyone, for participating, and I look forward to you completing the evaluation forms and submitting it to us. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.